It's a warm spring morning in April 1947. You're standing on the waterfront of Texas City, a small industrial town pressed against the western shore of Galveston Bay. The air smells of oil and salt, and the docks are already alive with the sounds of labor, the clang of cargo hooks, the low rumble of trucks pulling toward the wharves. You watch longshoremen loading paper sacks into the belly of a French cargo ship. The sacks are warm to the touch. They contain ammonium nitrate, a chemical fertilizer bound for war-ravaged Europe. It seems like ordinary work, another shipment in a world trying to rebuild itself. You don't know it yet, but within hours, this waterfront will cease to exist. What is about to happen here will become the deadliest industrial accident in American history. A catastrophe so vast it will reshape how a nation thinks about the chemicals it manufactures, stores, and ships. Texas City in 1947 was a place shaped entirely by industry. Located on the Texas Gulf Coast, roughly 40 miles southeast of Houston, it had grown around its deep water port and the refineries that lined its shore. Monsanto Chemical, Republic Oil, and other companies had built sprawling complexes here, drawn by the port's access to shipping lanes and the region's abundant petroleum. The town's population was around 16,000. Workers lived in modest homes within walking distance of the plants where they earned their living. The proximity of residential neighborhoods to heavy industry was unremarkable at the time. It was simply how these towns were built. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States had repurposed its wartime munitions infrastructure. Ammonium nitrate, once a key ingredient in explosives, was now being manufactured in vast quantities as agricultural fertilizer, part of a broader effort to help feed a devastated Europe. Texas City's port was one of the major embarkation points for these shipments. The SS Grandcamp was a Liberty ship, one of the thousands of mass-produced cargo vessels that had carried Allied supplies during the war. By 1947, it was operating under French registry, making routine cargo runs. In early April, it arrived at Texas City to take on a load of ammonium nitrate, along with other goods including twine, tobacco, and small arms ammunition. By the morning of April 16th, approximately 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate had been loaded into the Grand Camp's holds. The sacks were stacked deep in the lower cargo areas. What the longshoremen did not fully appreciate, what almost no one appreciated at the time, was just how volatile this substance could become under the right conditions. At approximately 8 a.m. on April 16th, longshoremen working aboard the Grand Camp noticed smoke rising from the number 4 hold deep in the ship. The source was unclear. Some accounts suggest a discarded cigarette may have ignited the cargo, though this was never confirmed. What is certain is that a fire had started among the sacks of ammonium nitrate. The ship's captain, Charles de Gillibon, ordered the holds sealed and steam pumped in to smother the fire, a standard procedure for shipboard fires. But ammonium nitrate does not respond to fire the way ordinary cargo does. The heat and pressure only accelerated the chemical reaction taking place below decks. The hatch covers began to bulge. An orange-brown smoke, thick and acrid, poured from the ship's ventilators. The water around the hull began to boil. Onlookers gathered at the waterfront to watch the spectacle, unaware of the danger. Some brought their children. Texas City's volunteer fire department arrived at the scene. The firefighters, many of them refinery workers who served in their off hours, pulled their trucks onto Pier Row and began attempting to fight the blaze. They had no reason to believe this was anything other than a difficult but manageable ship fire. Meanwhile, Workers at the nearby Monsanto chemical plant continued their shifts. Students at nearby schools began their morning lessons. Housewives hung laundry in the spring air. The fire aboard the Grand Camp had drawn attention, but daily life in Texas City continued around it, oblivious to the minutes that remained. At 9:12 a.m., the Grand Camp detonated. The explosion was one of the largest non-nuclear blasts in history. The entire ship was obliterated. A column of smoke and fire rose more than 2,000 feet into the air. The blast wave radiated outward at supersonic speed, flattening everything in its path. The Monsanto chemical plant, located just 700 feet from the dock, was destroyed almost instantly. Of the 574 workers on the morning shift, 234 were killed, and virtually all the rest were injured. The blast shattered windows in Houston, nearly 40 miles away. People in Louisiana reported feeling the ground shake. The explosion launched the Grand Camp's anchor, a piece of steel weighing nearly 2 tons, more than a mile and a half inland, where it embedded itself in the ground. Fragments of the ship rained down across the city. A 15-foot tidal wave surged from the harbor, sweeping across the waterfront and carrying wreckage deep into the streets. The entire volunteer fire department of Texas City, every man who had responded to the call, was killed in the explosion. All 27 of them. Their fire trucks were erased. There was simply nothing left at the point of detonation. The city's first line of defense against catastrophe had been standing at its epicenter. In the minutes that followed, survivors stumbled through a landscape that barely resembled the town they had known that morning. Buildings were flattened, cars were overturned and burning. A black, oily rain began to fall. Residue from the petroleum storage tanks that the explosion had ruptured and ignited. But the catastrophe was not over. Moored nearby was another cargo vessel, the SS High Flyer, which was also carrying ammonium nitrate, approximately 960 tons of it. The Grand Camp's explosion had set the High Flyer ablaze. Rescue workers attempted to tow the burning ship away from the docks, but the tow lines snapped. At 1:10 a.m. on April 17th, roughly 16 hours after the first explosion, the High Flyer detonated. The second blast destroyed what remained of the waterfront and the adjacent industrial infrastructure. By now, much of the area had been evacuated, but the explosion killed 2 more people and shattered the hopes of those who had begun to believe the worst was past. In the days that followed, rescue teams from across Texas converged on the city. The Red Cross set up emergency shelters. Soldiers from nearby Fort Crockett helped search the rubble. The task was grim. Many of the dead were unrecognizable. Identification often depended on personal effects: a watch, a ring, the contents of a pocket. The final death toll would reach at least 581 people, with some estimates placing the number higher. More than 3,500 were injured, over 1,000 homes were destroyed. The entire industrial waterfront of Texas City had been leveled. It was and remains the deadliest industrial disaster in American history. Among the dead were men and women of every background: refinery workers, ship crew, school children, bystanders who had simply come to watch a ship burn. The disaster did not discriminate. It took the curious alongside the dutiful, the young alongside the old. In the aftermath, the question of responsibility became deeply contentious. Survivors and the families of victims filed a class action lawsuit against the United States government, arguing that the federal government, which had overseen the manufacture and export of the ammonium nitrate, had failed to warn of its explosive potential. The case, Elizabeth Dalehite versus United States, made its way to the Supreme Court. In 1953, the court ruled 4-3 against the plaintiffs, holding that the government was protected by sovereign immunity under the Federal Tort Claims Act's discretionary function exception. The decision was bitterly received. The survivors were left without compensation from the federal government. It was not until 1955 that Congress passed a Special Relief Act, providing modest payments to the victims and their families. For many, the settlement felt inadequate, a gesture, not justice. The legal battle had taken nearly a decade. Texas City did rebuild. The refineries were reconstructed. New homes rose where the old ones had stood. The port resumed operations. Within a few years, the physical scars of the disaster had been largely covered over. But the human scars endured for generations. In the families who had lost fathers and mothers, in the survivors who carried shrapnel in their bodies for the rest of their lives. A memorial park was established at the site of the disaster. The Grandcamp's anchor, that 2-ton fragment hurled a mile and a half by the force of the explosion, was recovered and placed on display. It remains there today, silent and corroded, a monument to forces that were set in motion long before that April morning. The Texas City disaster reshaped American industrial safety regulation. It led to new standards for the labeling, storage, and transportation of hazardous materials. It forced a reckoning with the casual proximity of heavy industry to residential life, a proximity that had seemed natural, even inevitable, in the industrial towns of mid-century America. And yet, the lessons have not always held. In 2013, an ammonium nitrate explosion at a fertilizer storage facility in West Texas killed 15 people and injured more than 160. In 2020, a massive ammonium nitrate explosion devastated the port of Beirut, Lebanon, killing over 200. The chemical compound at the center of the Texas City disaster has not ceased to be dangerous. There is something haunting about a catastrophe that begins with ordinary work. Men loading sacks onto a ship on a spring morning, doing a job that needed doing, in a town that needed them to do it. The Texas City disaster reminds us that the most devastating forces are sometimes the ones we have learned to live beside, the ones we have stopped seeing as threats. The anchor still sits in its memorial park, half buried in the Texas earth. It was made to hold a ship in place. Now it holds something else. The memory of a morning that began like any other and ended in a silence that a city is still learning to speak about.